A man started on a bus trip. At first it was rough and expensive. Then it got cheaper and easier. But further on down the road it seemed to get rougher and more costly again. And for a time the man was puzzled by this turn of events. One man had a ready-made moral for all events. You can't be sure of anything. And although he has yet to have to call on it, he has a backup in case this one ever fails. Those who know that. You never can tell. Once your mental perception is not so tied to your present thinking, you will see that what men normally call their minds should actually be referred to as dead minds, or at least severely inactive. And now from our "if this be too harsh" files. If the above be too harsh, then ask yourself this: what could be said to be more important to one's existence than one's heart, and its operations thought of in any manner whatsoever as being and its operations never thought of in any manner whatsoever as being conscious and willfully deliberate? So, see, it's not as bad as you thought if you think about it more. It's only dead minds that rebel at hearing themselves talked about as such. So in conclusion, let us leave here remembering tonight's lesson, which is, by the way, if what we just heard did constitute a lesson of some sort, then why must it be brought directly to our attention? Well, anyway, I've started it, so here it is. Well, if we hadn't taken so long that you've already forgotten what it was. Anyway, the lesson therefrom: it never pays to be too harsh on yourself if your own mind is less alive and active as it could be. And you know that it is not by the fact that you tend to be harsh on yourself. See, that wasn't so harsh after all. There was once a race of men who believed that as long as you were talking that you wouldn't die. And then amongst them appeared a chap whose view developed to be that as long as you're talking, you can't really live, at least mentally. Of historical note is the fact that, in his day, he and his view eventually became as popular as a bad rash. And of more contemporaneous interest is the fact that, even today, his level of success has not dropped. There was once a man who decided to paint his house. He saw as his first job to select the color and equipment. This challenge became so engrossing that he never got around to you know what. And of your rights, I strongly favor it when you begin your stories with the words, "There was once a man," because then I know that you will not be talking about me. Right? Relievedly yours, etc. One man disliked being away from home so much that he continually thought about being back there. A lot of good that did. This concludes our non-inspirational thought for the day. And please, don't drive home carefully, or else you'll just wake up tomorrow still being you. Thank you, and good God. A man says, "I used to accept the notion of there being an American or French way of life, but then began to see it as a human way of life. Yet now have begun to realize it to be life's way of life." A man once undertook a great warfare, and in the beginning he believed he knew who the enemy was. But as the conflict progressed, he became less sure. Eventually he found himself struggling with what could be best described as shadows, ghosts, and vapors. Under ordinary conditions, men do not possess an individual mind. Their brain receives a minuscule part of the activity of life's universal mind. Nothing deserving to be even remotely called an individual mind is possible without intense, extensive individual effort. Everything else is simply the manifestations of a passive receiving unit. A king sought out a wise man and asked, "Is there anything you can tell me that will assist me in my search?" "Nothing that you could not ultimately tell yourself." And the ruler replied, "But I notice you included the word ultimately. You're pretty sharp." A man once went on a train trip. When he started out, he didn't know where he was going. Then he began to believe that he did and would talk to himself about it. But further along the journey, his notion of where he was headed underwent a sizable shift. Notice that I said further along the journey and not ultimately. That would have made it come out too neat, as might be related to the above story. And tales for true travelers should not be so easy and partially predigested. See, if you're really determined to get somewhere, you're already faced with the problem of your mind doing that to you regarding all ideas and information. Then there was once a man who began to write stories. And at first he would reread what he had written, rewrite, correct, edit, and possibly rewrite some more, until he was finally pleased with the result. His stories were so astounding and surprising, even to him, that they eventually had a particular effect on him which caused him to stop reading them once they were written. It maybe should be noted that this may have something to do with something maybe besides the actual writing of stories. I don't know. Maybe. What do you think? How to establish and operate a successful institution. First, if you're not sure what you're doing, claim that your competitors are even less sure. Second, whatever claims your competitors make for success, claim you can do it in half the time. Third, whenever confronted with your ignorance in your area of expertise, claim that your competitors are twice as ignorant. Fourth, if someone attempts to look up your dress, point them toward your competitors while claiming that they're hermaphrodites and a real sight to see. And lastly, if trapped and none of the above works, claim that yours is a mission from the gods and totally beyond mortal comprehension. And if you doubt any of this information, then just look in on how your own minds manage to successfully survive. As suspected and reflected in much of man's folklore, the universe is full of little people. And men are them. Tonight's fact worth remembering: things magnetic don't care what they attract. Or is that who? Now on to tonight's mental health update. One way by which you can gauge the future likelihood of you ever going crazy is by how serious you are presently. Long ago and far away was once a land in which citizens were deemed to be officially sane and reliable if they would automatically stand and salute whenever they heard the song, "Hold On," by all means, hold on. On the quest for consciousness, the idea of stick-to-itiveness has at least two understandings not commonly utilized. And then there was this other chap who, whenever he'd hear the term "an idea worth remembering," would laugh and laugh over the fact that it didn't include the necessary restriction of, but not more than once. A king once sought out a wise man and asked, "Why are those believed to know the truth about life reputed to have bad memories?" And the sage replied, "Do you mean they're reputed to remember bad things, or that their memory of things is bad?" And the ruler was quiet for a moment and said, "I've forgotten what I asked." And the wise one said, "Then you owe me $400 for professional services rendered," which the king was suddenly awakened sufficiently to be delighted to pay. Ah, but life is sweet when you're king, or a wise man, or your memory is so faulty that you don't remember all the crap that's happened to you. There was once a giant mythical creature, the size of the universe, which gave birth to every other creature now found therein. Everyone has now forgotten how they got here and invents stories to compensate therefor. such as this one. No, see, that was the little joke in this. Where when ordinary minds are backed into a corner, they will accept as relief the appearance of a mirror. And wow, does that not reveal a lot? And one man said, I will not sleep with any woman without knowing where and with whom she has been in the past. A common sentiment regarding things physical, but one which men never seem inclined to apply to those of the mind. There was once a world on which the whole concept of mental health was wrapped up in their idea of originality. One man says he has a Balzac of a time, I guess as opposed to that English author sort, deciding which is the funniest of the following things: humility, autobiographies, or guilt. He swears that life is just full of them. And now for some news from the field of science and technology. The German Patent Office this week has issued official recognition for a Hamburg inventor's new idea for a bullshit detector. And without getting too deep into technical details, it works like this. Potentially noxious bullshit is present in the air if it is observed that in the immediate vicinity, human mouths are in operation. And stuff marches on. For ordinary men to engage in a continuing, running analyzation of their thinking would be a step up. But for those involved with such as this, it can ultimately prove to be a slow death by meaningless distraction. When ordinary men think of the question why, they perceive it in a sense of asking why a certain thing happened to them, while more alive minds see the question of why as being an investigation into how everything is connected. There was once a village in which lived a man who everyone believed had discovered the truth about life. And after discussing this among themselves, decided they should react in some fashion. Initially, it was proposed that they all get together and go beat him up. Then someone opined that a better course would be to go ask him what the truth about life was. Then this became the focus of their discussions for a while, with some excited over it and all in favor of it, while others were fearful and hesitant regarding what they might hear, and things reached an impasse. So, to facilitate something getting done, here's what they decided. That half of them would ask the other half what the truth about life is, while in response the other half would beat up the half who had asked. And when this decision was put into action, the man who they had originally suspected of knowing the secret was momentarily puzzled as to the source of all the turmoil. That's it. There was once a man who lived in the minority. The land in which he lived was himself. And since everyone's home is in the majority, that is to say, in the entirety of what is, no one notices that they are individually in the minority. There was once, and always is, a man here and there who discovers the reality of everyone's homeland, and in so doing, frees himself from the strangling grip of, meaningless allegiance to, places of origins that never were. Yes, in one real sense, man's consciousness is held captive, but his mind is not able to pinpoint the location. If you're right, so I trust you will not accuse me of being overly religious, but I feel obliged to say to you that all I see you doing is renaming Satan, the father of all evil, and calling him the mind. Do you see where I'm coming from? Sincerely, etc. A guy got life on the phone and said, I hate to carry tales, but you wouldn't believe how some people here are talking about you. And life hung up on him. It is almost impossible to be instantly, stably conscious while talking. This includes internally as well. Fact, the dead can be happy as long as they don't know they are. Doubt it? Just check with your mind. Yeah, fat chance like it'd tell you the truth or something. There was once a man who discovered a path worn in the high grass. He began following it. It turned out to take him back where he had begun. That last line is incorrect, but they won't allow me to give you the right one. On one planet was a horrible and ferocious rat which, when cornered, would lash out with mind-numbing seriousness. And its local name, curiously enough, was the mind. Several partial astronauts trapped in between worlds were heard to say, "We don't get it," and which we suspect is why we're here. They wanted to holler help, but realized the futility thereof, them being in a vacuum and all. Or is that a vacuum being in them? Man is not the source of what he does, but rather the outlet for the source. When asked about his beliefs, one man replied, "I have no beliefs. My mind does." He found this posture so refreshing that he is now trying to shift it over to also include his emotions. If you're right, sometimes listening to you go on and on just wears me out. Though I must admit, nothing like listening to me. Thanks for this at least. Yours for greater and more insightful silence, Mr. Clarence M., etc., and so on. Rather than retiring to a monastery, one man sat for many years alone before a mirror. And what he eventually realized was so surprising, so astounding, that he wrote a cookbook. Solitude is not the only way out of professional wrestling. One man swallowed something. It turned out to be himself. He got lodged halfway down. Now come out fighting. Everyday people need physical companionship. They need emotional companionship as well. This idea would come as no surprise to them, but to include the mind would. So declared one man, "I think, therefore I am a piece of everybody." Not the declaration of the awakened. After many years of strenuous study and research on the subject of humor, one man has concluded that the true punchline to every single joke known to man is the word mind. He says that discovering this cracks him up something terrible, except on those occasions when it makes him break down in tears. A guy got Life on the phone and said, "Hey, so how's it going?" And Life replied suspiciously, "Who is this?" Those of you with any sort of recall, we're not talking total, might recall, my God, yeah, this. We were mentioning last time when I was pointing out that an ordinary person living out their ordinary life and never giving any objective notice to their thinking, which, as a matter of fact, no matter what they call it themselves, is the distinguishing lemming of their sense of themselves. But if they live out their life giving no notice to their thinking, then there are, if you recall, we drew numbers out from under an armpit, and it came out 4, so I gave 4 characteristics. I could have given 1, I could have given 7. Well, no, that was Monday. I could have given 8. But as it turned out, the number that we drew, fair and square, you remember I had someone here from the audience observing it, along with my attractive assistant. The number was 4, so we listed 4 characteristics that, while they seem real and operational enough with a human, an ordinary person, would not withstand any objective scrutiny. But this, as it is at the heart of what people consider to be, what they feel to be their individual personality, all tied around thinking, which is the singular aspect of man, except for you people who have 6 toes. The 4 characteristics turned out to be, regarding thinking, and the kind of overall lifelong effect, same as having 6 toes, lifelong effect it has of aspects of influences that, while without any doubt are operationally effective, if they were looked at objectively, would not operate quite so effectively. They would crumble. They are, the people believe, they assume, they think that their thinking is theirs individually and that is theirs uniquely. In the same way that everyone, without any doubt, takes their personality, whether for good or ill. You take your personality of an ordinary person to be yours. Number two, that one's thinking can be altered. It can be changed as circumstances, as changes in circumstances would dictate to a sane, reasonable person with a reasonable number of toes. And number three, that compared to what they do in life, compared to what they do in the ordinary sense, they take thinking to be of importance. They take thinking to be of more importance than it is. And for those of you with good memory, what I really said was they take thinking to be of any importance. So those of you that can remember that, do so, and those of you who can't, assume that I just said what I said tonight. And number four, which just because of the number that came out from under the hat, is that people take their emotions to be a separate entity with a life of their own. Ordinary men, not even those interested in such as this, but ordinary men are not as intelligent as they could be by their own definition. Not by mine, but by their own concept of what being intelligent is. They are not as intelligent as they could be if they gave some attempted objective consideration of their thinking. As long as, and that as you know by now, or I'll tell you again, this program is not to change people's mind or to convert them to anything, and it is certainly not to change large numbers of people's mind, if the first statement is correct. But let me preface this by giving you some general context of what I was going to say, that it would change. It's not going to, and it's not intended to. But if this did occur, that is, if men did, in large numbers, undertake any attempted objective, just look-see at their thinking, it would change the whole face, the whole complexion, except those people with an undue number of fingers and toes, who are generally known to have bad skin conditions. That would change the whole complexion of human existence. The whole sense of individuality. People do not analyze it this way, but it is literally tied to the mind. It is not analyzed this way even in psychology. They never even come close to this. Part of the tricky aspect of it is I can point out that people believe that they are individualistically, most people, on the basis of their physique, themselves physiologically. In fact, the less they're engaged in, or the less importance thinking seems to play in their life, whether it does or not, but the less importance they think it plays or that it seems to play, the more that they seem to consider their physiology, their physical life, to be of importance, which is kind of the general statement of the breakdown of the so-called socio-economic spectrum. But, see, the tricky aspect is that first, do you follow? I don't know, would you repeat that? All right. I didn't know I did imitations. What's frightening is, what if that was not an imitation? Look into your own souls before you cast bad David Brenners toward the stage. It's not David Brenner anyway. David. Where is he now that I need him? His career was hot as hell when Nixon was in office. David, you figure it out. An ordinary person would say that without any doubt that a man's physique, his physical life, is the most important aspect of his feeling of individuality. The tricky part is, at first blush, that sounds true. And at one level, it is correct. But here's the thing, a man has no sense of individuality without having a mind, without thinking. You never see lions preening. You never see elephants posturing. It is only with the mind that a creature has a sense of itself. It must be able to think, to have any sense that I am a self separate from life, particularly separate from my kind, separate from the herd, the pack. And it certainly has no sense of being individualistic, that there is anything unique. It simply can't think. There is no such concepts in the nonverbal world. That's not to say that the concept has any validity in the nonverbal, but it appears to. So, if you can see that, it's a simple fact. You can observe it. I mean, your mind, most people's minds will shut down at that point, but it is a fact that it is thinking that is the source, the center, the outline, the basis of the totality of information available for a person to have a concept of being individualistic. And it is, of course, then the mind that will look at the body and say, well, I'm fairly good looking, or I'm particularly ugly, or I'm too fat, I'm too thin, that it can come up with these ideas that seem to, or that obviously to the mind has a direct bearing on its sense of itself. But I repeat, were it not for the mind being extant, there would be no sense of oneself one way or the other. It would not exist. That's just one of those many areas, again, that it's obvious as hell, but it's quite common. I'll predict it would be quite common. If it was pointed out to ordinary sane people, they just wouldn't hear it, because I know the operation of the mind. It's no offense to the people involved, but the mind operates in such a way that it would not even hear that. But it is an obvious fact if you can see it. So if you see it, we'll press on. And assuming you do, we'll press on. It is what's going on in a person's brain that constitutes, or I'll put it another way, it is the operations going on in a person's brain that without which there would be no sense of individuality, right or wrong, good or ill. Thus you have everyone operating on the basis that they're thinking the same as their sense of themselves being individualistic, being theirs. To some degree, well, if asked, they would say it's unique, not to some degree singular. That's the baddest thing, to some degree unique, except now Dr. Webster and a few of us are in the minority and behind the times. Well, as you can say, to some degree unique. So there I said it, and I'm glad I finally did it in public. It's not as bad as I thought. The first time, they say, is always the worst. But evil linguists will tell you anything to get you to try it. So you can't always trust their word. It's like the real ratty kid when you're young telling you, go ahead and jump in that pond. Now, he's been in it before, and it's at least 6 feet deep. You take your chance. This time you were lucky, but watch it. An ordinary man takes his thinking to be individual and to him unique. Even that one statement, if anyone analyzed it to any degree on the basis of that which is observably true to ordinary sight, you could take an EKG of someone's heartbeat. You could rig up some sort of something, I don't know whether they've ever done it, that would take at least the tempo, the rate at which one's respirational system operates. You could take, let's say those two things to begin with, and you could print out what would amount to, within reason, a personal footprint of the man or woman. That their EKG, you would assume, has a pattern that more or less would be distinguishable from other patients, from other people. And then in some way, if we measured over a long period of time the respiration, then you could make some kind of footprint somewhere, drawing a chart of the time and the inhalation, the exhalation, the relationship between the two. And if you wanted to extend the apparent singularity, or look for the singularity, to try and extend the distinguishing aspects, then you could track it over periods, the time of day, kinds of stress they might be under, how much food they eat. At any rate, you could come up with what would amount to some sort of crude, individualistic footprint of the person. You could also do it with emotions, I would say, but that's not supposed to be on the list anyway. And you can do it with the brain pattern, of course. Are you sure? What if you could? You apparently can. Then what I was going to say that I was going to suggest should be of some interest that no one ever considers. If indeed, let us say that your heartbeat, your respirational operation, and even the firing of your brain waves, if they would constitute, we could translate it into some sort of chart, some sort of hard data, which could be done. Let's say it would translate into a footprint in some way of your individuality. Does anyone, any sane person, believe other than the fact that they were born with their heartbeat, their pattern, the rate at which it operates, their respiration, just the unanalyzed firing of the brain? Does anyone, any sane person, believe other than the fact that they were born operating at those speeds, operating at those tempos, operating at those intensities? Does anyone, put it another way, does anyone, any ordinary person, sane person, would they say that after they got to be of a reasonable age, after they had had their at least intellectual bar mitzvah and could think a bit, that they undertook, that they are in some way responsible for the rate at which they inhale and exhale, that they in some way altered, changed, improved, had any effect on the rate at which their heart beats and the amount of blood it may move in them? Would they say that in any way, if you can, I started to leave out the brain, but you people are supposed to be big goyles and boils. Well, just a second. Let's leave it to the first two. Would anybody seriously say that? And the answer is, of course, no. And yet they will say that their mind has in some way been developed. Well, first of all, been acquired. The intellectual capacity, the capacity to think, to reason, has been postnatally acquired. I suppose for you people with 6 ears, a postnasal drip is postnatally acquired the ability to think. Separating as always, as all sane men want to do, separating the brain from the mind, which I must give them credit is a small stroke of genius. Or looked at another way, it was the last-ditch attempt at a desperate man. Or, put more technically, it is a thing that had to be. Thank you, Jesus. So, no one would say otherwise. No one would claim other than the fact that they were born, for good or ill again, for whatever slight flaws or questions they may have about its operation, but that no one would question the fact that they were born genetically. They were tied to, or they were born with their own heartbeat pattern, their own respirational pattern. They were born with it. And men, if asked, which they're seldom asked, and even if they're asked, they even less often will respond in any coherent manner as to, well, how you got a nice heartbeat there. I like that. You listen. Or you go, I got to compliment you the way you breathe. I mean, I like it. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And you go, but all of that, you are already impressive enough. But after talking to you, I would like to really extend my personal kudos to your thinking. And then people will really chipper up. They will blossom. Because now you're getting somewhere. You're getting into the land of Oz and the Grimm brothers. But they will really brighten up. Because here now finally is something for which they can take credit. Because assuming that up until that point you had passed yourself off as being a equally sane and reasonable person, then they know not to try and take great credit when you get up close and say, do you mind? And, you put your ear to their chest after reassuring them that you're not some sort of pervert. And you go, what a heartbeat. I thought I heard it. I just wanted to compliment you. There's not a great deal they can do to take. All they can do is, kind of go, well, thank you. And hope that you get away from their chest shortly. Unless they're a pervert. I don't want to get into that. This is not a show for perverts. In most cities, it's the Perverts Roundtable. I noticed that, at least when we're shown on Fridays in large cities, that usually precedes this one. So you people looking for that, you tuned in at least an hour late. And in 3 cities, by the way, it's the Atheist Viewpoint precedes us. So anyway, I can't keep up with everything. This is not either one of those shows, I don't think. At any rate, a person will not take any personal credit for the way in which their heart beats or the way in which they inhale and exhale, the way in which they breathe. You mention their thinking, and they will be delighted to take credit. They will be delighted to discuss it almost as long as you can keep your eyes open as to how they managed, how they worked for, and was able to reach a point of being so mentally attractive, adroit, and just all around neat. This is the basis of all of the things listed on the board up there. And it's on the basis of me saying that if men gave just that part, the basis of it, any attempt at analyzation, an objective look at, it would change, which it's not going to, and it's not supposed to, but it would change the whole face of life on this planet. Because there is no basis whatsoever that any intelligent man can come up with, not one. This is not one of the ones I'll say I suggest, since I know sometimes civilians and people of a timid nature happen to turn on their television, even to channels like this, that I say things like I suggest or check it out for yourself. We'll bypass that. I'll just tell you for a fact. There is not no ordinary mind can come up with the slightest shred of evidence. There is nothing to even suggest that he is responsible in any way for his thinking. And minds will immediately jump in and say, well, that's not true because I took a second job to pay my way through college. I one time took a tax preparation course at night just for the fun of it. I told you it was a waste of time. If you look, anybody who now, if we're not talking about the kinds of people who would stoop so low as to do taxes for a living, then if we're talking now about fairly decent men and women, and you know how to turn anything resembling a cold-blooded eye on your own thinking, and you can do it often enough, collect enough information on the basis, if you're looking for this, of me saying that there is not one shred, there's no reason to believe, I say shred of evidence, the mind can't find evidence of anything. But the mind, if you do it, it can't even feel. It will finally be struck contrary, that it feels the validity of what I'm saying, that there is nothing going on in your mind that gives the least feel as being something for which you are individually responsible. A crude way of putting it, which some of you should find of interest. I was first going to put it that what everyone has amounted to when we speak of someone's individual mind, what it amounts to, and what I'm about to say is not actually the most accurate description, but I'm going to use the one that is probably the easiest to stand here and verbally deal with a kind of random civilian audience on tape. And that is to say that each person, if we're talking about 6 billion people on this planet, and each person has got 1/6 of the collective mind of man. And the part I was going to say is of some interest. All of you, I assume, are well read enough to know that there is a term came from a well-known intellectual source, a psychologist in the West, on this planet in the last 100 years, who came up with the concept of what is normally called now the collective unconscious of man. Just a rough reading of what he did seemed to be that he was interested in all the kinds of coincidences, the coincidental appearances of certain myths, stories, and all kinds of unexplainable behavior in man. and he concluded that there was an unconscious reservoir, an unconscious mind into which all men were plugged, into which all men dipped. It is now part of the fairly common parlance of any educated person today. The part I was going to say is of interest is not that, because I assume you all already read about that. Here's what you should find of interest, which is always the case when we get to this point in the operations of the mind on this planet, is notice a world-famous figure, and that in some way helped, I'm sure, his continuing fame, but came up. And a man of academic standing, a man of credentials. He, not just some idea, he's not a street corner philosopher, he came up after much research, study, pondering, that there is some sort of unconscious mind into which men either are plugged into or they have the ability to dip into it, and that explains things happening here and there at different times, different places, and it being there's him sensing or pointing out, besides his sensing of it, some sort of common threads that continue to run through that are inexplicable except with this explanation. All right. The point is, it helped his fame, that it seems to answer many questions. It was taken, it was accepted by a wide number of intellectuals, and as I said, now it's down to the point that it's almost part of a fairly educated man's vocabulary. But notice, you mean you got to get the part you're going to say that should be of interest? You got it. Notice this. It seems to explain a lot, and I'm not going into it. You can figure that out. It would seem to explain a lot of things. But notice, his mind, not him, but his mind was incapable of doing the real thing. The real thing would have been, never mind this thing about a collective unconscious, a collective conscious. Huh? Well, I always hope. It's the same thing, just on a different scale, in a different context. It's the same thing as the idea of men coming up with the notion of gods to explain that behavior for which they do not want to take credit or for which they cannot take credit, that is gods and anti-gods. And then the variation of that, forget for a moment the collective consciousness concept. The whole idea now in the Western world, or throughout the world, it's had some effect, that men not only have a conscious mind, but an unconscious mind. And it seems to be a beautiful marriage. A twin is a marriage of real mutual benefit. Because the mind can take, a man's mind can take credit for that which his mind wishes to take credit for. Those things that touch the mind, that seem to be products and aspects of the mind for which that particular mind does not care to be directly associated, it can refer to my unconscious mind or my subconscious mind. It's all the same thing. And the truth is, I did not mean that as an assault on psychology. It doesn't deserve an assault any more than religion or anything else does. But notice the beauty of the idea of a subconscious mind in us all. It is absolutely delightful. The same as religion is. From one view, it is just a side splitter. It should just bring a smile to your face, at least the first once or twice you actually, once you realize what it's up to and its purpose, and you think, well, my, I didn't realize that. It is a small stroke of life-induced genius. Because those very things that the mind cannot look under ordinary conditions directly into, as long as it has, it can just slightly do this, kind of shoot its cuff and do its shoulder and kind of go, and look somewhere and go, well, yeah, I know what you're saying about me. Yeah, I know what you're saying, but hey, the devil, they had a bad night up on Olympus last night, and now we are paying the consequences for the God's hangovers. Or the old subconscious. The mind can do that, and it is beautiful in the sense that it to itself, to minds collectively, to the collective mind of man, is not only acceptable, it seems to be revealing. Except you say, reveal what? Aha, it says, and it holds a mirror back up to you. Aha, and there's nothing to say to a mirror. Well, not if you recognize that it's a mirror. But if you don't, it is the mind continually going, well, now I know why you might say that, but. And then, once it says but, once you know where it's going, no matter what it starts doing, you know what's coming out. It's right back to you. It apparently has gone somewhere. It has gone nowhere. Can you call the reflection in the mirror, can you say that you're the source of it? If you ask an ordinary mind that, they would go, well, certainly. If you're looking at yourself, it has to be you. Back to the question. Back to my fact. If the mind had the ability and the interest to look at it, what goes on in it, it would in no wise have any feel for, find any evidence of, the first part's best. It would have no feel of anything going on in there having anything to do with it personally. It would not feel it to be individualistic. It would not feel it to be in any way unique. It would, taken far enough, which an ordinary mind couldn't do. It's all that an unordinary mind, such as somebody involved with this, can do. It's all they can do. But push far enough, you begin to feel, in a sense, no real negative sense, but you begin to feel alien to what's going on in there. There's not a good word for it. Distant, you begin to feel separate. It is simply, it's the heartbeat in the brain. It's the sound of you breathing with postnasal drip, but it's in the brain. It's the sound of your joints cracking, but it's in the brain. It's the sound of you being alive, but it's in the brain. Like I said, it's not really alien, but insofar as people now taking their thoughts to be themselves, that the more you're civilized, the more you're an up-to-date kind of guy, the more important your thinking is. The more undeniably tied to, the more undeniably your sense of reality, your sense of identity is tied to your thinking. Because men are not now what would be, in a sense, or from one view, a stronger sense of one's individuality or identity would be under conditions wherein we were up each morning faced with a struggle, a daily struggle for mere survival. Under those conditions, your sense of identity would truly rest more in your body. Thinking would be of less and less consequence, or be of less consequence than it is today, your mental activity. And any sense, if you were minimally verbal, read mental, but if you were just minimally mental, your sense of, and faced each day with a struggle for survival, your sense of identity would be, without any doubt, tied to your body. And from another view, those of you that seem to be interested, that is one other view of the popularity of sports, spectator sports. And I assume by now you realize the more sophisticated, the more intellectual be the area, the greater is the interest in spectator sports. You get into areas, if we could move now on this planet, to areas that they are indeed still struggling for daily existence. To try to get them interested in a football game is you'd have your hands full. When people are just trying to feed themselves and their family each day, it is real hard to get them concerned about the international lacrosse playoffs. It is when the person's sense of identity, their sense of individuality, the more it is tied to thinking. If we had this kind of spectrum that always, once you begin to see all kinds of spectrums, that's why spectrums exist, and that's why they won't let you on. But when things go one way, there's always something going another way. It's only ordinary minds that traffic whizzes by and people go, wow, Hubert, did you see that? If Hubert had his wits about him, he'd go, yeah, but did you see that? But don't hold your breath. At any rate, the spectrum is this. The more this is moving toward a civilization, a society, an area of the world, a group of people that are more and more intellectually oriented, more and more lard asses doing work up here that about all they do, that their sense of themselves is here. The more it goes there, and it doesn't mean that each individual, doesn't mean it's true for each individual, but that is where, in that same area going this way, is where you will find the greatest interest in spectator sports. Think about it. Not people who are out each day having to hunt and work 10 or 12 hours just to feed themselves. In other words, they're engaged in physical activity for the sake of survival. But an ordinary man, now under the conditions under which people who would be within the sound of my body odor would operate, their sense of identity is tied around and based around the core of thinking. If they had any ability to look at it, they would find that there is no sense in their head, there is no basis for any sensation of individuality. Can you consider what that would do to the rest of the things listed on that board? And even though I didn't intend to get into it, a man's emotional life. It would perhaps be easier, or I could make it sound easier to a group of random civilian listeners. I could have said what I said tonight, and instead of talking about the mind, talked about emotions, and said, just changed a few terms here and there, but said the same thing about a man's emotional life. And very likely, with an ordinary group of people, that would have had a greater effect, or that would have been easier for them to hear, or they would have found it of more interest to hear. But it would have been the same thing. Because apparently you could plot an individual footprint off of a man's emotional life. If you just question him about it, if we just took from the ordinary vocabulary of psychology or everyday wisdom, everyday thinking, if we just took a list of all the major emotions, which probably wouldn't run to more than a dozen, and we list them across on a graph, and then we question people about, picked out time periods, days of the week, different highlights of their life, how it's tied to how much they've eaten, how it's tied to how they physically feel, and all sorts of things. You could plot that and come out with what would amount to some sort of thing that would resemble a footprint of this man's individuality based upon his change, based upon his emotional life. It too will not withstand anything resembling objective scrutiny. Just look at. I keep saying scrutiny like it takes a lifelong of hard-pressed interest locked into some lab. All it takes is anything resembling objective look-see. And a man's so-called emotional life, his emotional individuality would crumble in the same way his sensation of having an individual, unique thinking life would vanish. Does anyone find that of any practical? Can anyone suspect? Can anyone imagine in your own life any practical use for that? And since I know everyone's answer would be no, we will not bother to have a show of hands. There's no need for us all to embarrass ourselves. All right, you want to try it this way. You want me to ask who does that actually embarrass, and then find out that it embarrasses no one. All right, you want to try it this way. Do you want me to ask who finds it somewhat off-putting that you weren't immediately embarrassed by it? Or for those of you that have a hard time following it, you want me to ask who finds it somewhat embarrassing that you weren't embarrassed by the first question? Well, all right. Does anybody suspect that that's the same sort of probably feather-ruffling, round-robin that an ordinary mind would find itself involved with if an ordinary man found itself involved with such as this? It wasn't bad when you started, and I thought I might be interested in where you're going. But I'll be damned if I know where you went. Thank you, thank you. Thank you very much. And at least I take all the credit. Remember this. Most of the credit goes to your mind. I am just your humble servant.